Madam President?
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to again speak on the multifaceted crisis that has defined our southern border and how the inaction and misleading rhetoric from President Biden and his administration has only exacerbated and continued the continued fallout our country is experiencing. Since the beginning of his tenure in the White House, President Biden's trademark has been border chaos, with over 6.3 million illegal border crossings under his watch. Actions do speak louder than words, and President Biden continues to prove that his priorities are miles and miles away from the southern border. He has only visited the southern border once since becoming president, and he has supported funding cuts to the Department of Homeland Security in his recent budget proposal, and that department is charged with securing the border. Our Border Patrol agents deserve needed support from the administration, who has laid the crisis they face squarely at their feet. In this past week, according to the U.S. Border Patrol, there have been 67,759 apprehensions, 15,780 approximate getaways, 179 pounds of meth, 56 pounds of fentanyl, and 34 pounds of cocaine, all seized at our southern border in just 168 hours. With our Border Patrol stretched inconceivably thin with little support from the administration, it's hard to fathom the true amount of illegal crossings, human trafficking, and illegal drugs that are currently entering our country through the southern border. On top of all this, on Sunday, a person on the U.S. terror watch list was arrested at the U.S.-Mexico border crossing in San Diego. This further proves the national security implications regarding this border crisis and the message displayed to the world about the state of our ports of entry. The impact of the unprecedented amount of drugs entering through our southern border is certainly not lost on me either, nor anyone in this body. My state of West Virginia has seen the impact of this crisis directly, and it has created irreversible scars on our communities. I just mentioned 56 pounds of fentanyl has been seized just last week alone. That's enough fentanyl to kill 12 million Americans. Recent data from the CDC shows that between 2016 and 2021, fentanyl overdoses have risen 279% in this country. Those aged the ages of 24 through 44 has the highest overdose rates, and those involved fentanyl. Through conversations I've had on this topic with the Biden administration officials, I have found their answers to be highly insufficient. This is a crisis that is killing a generation, and we know that these drugs are flowing across our southern border. The administration needs a better answer, and they must swiftly act to stop this killer. Now, as the Title 42 authority has expired, it's added to the confusion on the southern border. The Biden administration is trying to reset a new normal based on failed policies as an attempt to redefine and hide their border failures. Trust me, the American people are not fooled by the recent victory lap taken by the Biden administration or their effort to claim success or progress. To the Biden administration, what they consider low numbers still far exceed the daily average of the prior administration. In fact, if illegal crossings continue at the levels that the administration is touting, this White House is on track to break the previous record they set last year for the number of illegal immigrants caught at the border. This just is not lost on the American people. Unfortunately, this is a habit we've kind of seen from this president. We saw similar messaging antics from the administration regarding gas prices when they touted decreases that still put us above the average before President Biden even took office. The same goes for inflation, which saw record increases Only after Democrats supercharged spending, yes, it came down, but it's still way, way too high. Mitigating the border crisis is an ongoing effort and one we have to monitor closely. For example, will the administration's actions of the past week create a massive backlog of asylum claims? What does that do to our system? This only adds to the issue of interior enforcement, something the Biden administration has clearly never prioritized. Despite the president's too little, too late action, our border remains open. I know with certainty that once someone enters our country, the chances of them being expelled are very, very low. As we move forward, the situation of the border needs to be tightly watched, and it needs to be tracked over time. If it deviates based on many different factors and changes to policies that we are currently experiencing, but above all else, we have to remain committed to policies that do secure the border, policies that protect our communities. I don't know how these border communities are doing it. I really don't. Policies that support our Border Patrol officers, and policies that prevent the unprecedented humanitarian tragedy that has become the custom over the past several years, whether it's the drug influx, the human trafficking, and just the human sorrow that we see that this is generating. My Republican colleagues and I remain committed to this mission, and I encourage the Biden administration to do the same. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from North Dakota.
Madam President, I'm here today to join my colleague from West Virginia and others in, again, calling on the administration to secure our southern border. Last Thursday, I traveled to Brownsville, Texas with my colleagues to show support for the Border Patrol agents and to see firsthand the situation at the border as Title 42 expires. I've traveled repeatedly to the southern border, and each time I go, I see more and more people coming across illegally. I've been to McAllen, I've been to Del Rio, been to Eagle Pass, I've been to El Paso, been to Mexico, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Colombia, both sides of the border. And as I go each time, more and more people are crossing the border illegally. In the 3 days leading up to the end of Title 42, Border Patrol reported 10,000 plus encounters each day, and almost 83,000 for the week. In the first 6 months of fiscal year 2023, CBP encountered more than 1.5 million individuals. That's 6 months, 1.5 million individuals in 6 months. That compares to about 2.5 million crossing illegally last year. That means at the pace we're on, it will be more than 3 million coming illegally this year. This truly is a crisis, and it's one that has been caused by the Biden administration's unwillingness to enforce the law and reinstate policies that have been shown very clearly to work in the last administration. In Brownsville, we saw the crisis firsthand, and we met with Border Patrol professionals who told us what needs to happen to stop the flow of illegal immigration. And we can get a handle on this right now if the Biden administration will simply enforce the law. We know this from our Border Patrol professionals, the experts on the front line. They're the ones telling us this. That includes enforcing the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, or the Remain in Mexico policy, which would require people seeking asylum at the southern border to wait in Mexico while their case is adjudicated, and enforcing the Third Safe Country Protocols, again, as the prior administration did, so that individuals seeking asylum from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and other countries must wait for their claim to be adjudicated before they come into the country. But instead of requiring individuals seeking asylum to remain in Mexico or to submit an asylum claim in the first safe country they cross into, the Biden administration is creating a demand pull for these individuals, because they not only allow them to cross illegally and come in to the country, but they allow them to stay in the country illegally, and they also provide a work permit and benefits. So when Secretary Mayorkas says, oh, the border is closed, that's not the message that goes to South America, and now actually more than 100 countries where people are coming across our border illegally from more than 100 different companies. The message that the coyotes and others tell the people that they're trafficking across the border is, oh, we'll get you into the country, you'll be able to stay, you'll get a work permit, and you'll get benefits. So of course they're going to come, and they continue to come. And what the Biden administration is doing is they just process them faster. They just process them faster. With the expiration of Title 42, Alejandro Mayorkas says he is enforcing Title 8, but he's not. Here's what he's doing. When individuals come across the border illegally, initially, he's saying under Title 8, well, you have to have an asylum claim, and that has to be adjudicated, so you can't stay. So all the individual has to say is, well, I want to appeal that, and they get a preliminary hearing. So they're given a phone number. They don't even have to go to the hearing. They're given a phone number. They call the court, and they say, okay, I'm appealing the claim. I'm here for asylum. And they're given a work permit, an alien identification number. They get a work permit, and they get benefits. And they don't have to go to the court. Their hearing is just calling up on the phone. And then they're scheduled for a court date 3 years, 5 years down the line while they're in the country. That's not enforcing Title 8. And that's why more and more people are coming. That's why 2.5+ million came last year, and there'll be 3 million plus coming this year. What are you seeing around the country? Now in New York, they're putting migrants who've come here illegally in gymnasiums and schools. What is it, 20 schools? And Mayor Adams complains about Governor Abbott sending people up to him. Well, Mayor Adams should call the White House, because the White House has sent up 10 times as many people as Governor Abbott has. So maybe he's complaining about the wrong person. But that's what's going on. How about fentanyl? How about the drugs that are pouring into our country illegally, affecting every state? How about human trafficking? How about human trafficking? How about all the things that are happening to these people as they're coming up here at the hands of the coyotes? And how about the people that don't have $8,000 to $12,000 to pay the coyotes, to pay the cartels to come here? What do you suppose happens when they get here? That the coyotes or the cartels just say, oh, that's fine, don't worry about paying back that $8,000 or that $12,000. Not only for you, but for your kids. Or maybe they're indentured servants until they can pay off that debt. And how do they pay off that debt? What do they have to do? What are they bound to when they're up here? That's the kind of human suffering that's being created by this border policy. And the reality is it can end right now. It can end right now. Biden administration says, well, Congress needs to pass a law. Well, what good does it do for Congress to pass a law if the Biden administration won't enforce the laws they have right now? We are a compassionate country. We allow 1 million people to come here every year legally. But we've got to enforce our border. And that's not being done. And every American needs to understand that the Biden administration doesn't need more tools or more laws to secure the border. They have the tools. They have the law to do it. They just won't. They want an open border. Border security is national security. You're seeing that impact. You're seeing people come from more than 100 different countries. A lot of those people aren't vetted. And that doesn't even count the gotaways, the people that cross between the ports of entry, that our Border Patrol professionals don't have time to stop because they're so busy processing more and more and more migrants that come here illegally under the Biden administration policies. It's way past time to end the border crisis that the Biden administration has created. Border security is national security. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, the border's not open. The border is not open. That's what DHS Secretary Mayorkas told the American people repeatedly. I guess that's pretty easy to say when you're sitting in your office in Washington, D.C., but I rise to tell the truth to the American people. Just recently, I led a group of senators to the epicenter of this crisis in Brownsville, Texas, on the eve Title 42 was being lifted. Why Brownsville, you might ask? Because that's where the cartel had moved the mass migration to. I reckon that was the easiest way to get all the people from Venezuela that they'd recruited to come to America. That was the easiest, the most economical route to get them to the border, was from Venezuela to Brownsville, Texas. I have to tell you, it's worse than I expected. The scene was bleak, the morale was at an all-time low, and there was no sign of this crisis ending anytime soon. At least that's what was going on our side of the border. On the other side of the border, these migrants were celebrating. They were having a party. The worst part of their journey was over. We toured Camp Monument. Now, Camp Monument was a park just weeks before, but the Border Patrol had come in there and set up an emergency command post. Now, again, the DHS Secretary is telling us the border is open, but this is what the Border Patrol told us. Just the day before, 11,000 illegal migrants had been recorded at this location alone, and more than 3,000 gotaways the same day. 3,000 gotaways. You put those two together, that's the size of my hometown, Great Bend, America. Now, we saw this week with the arrest of the Afghani on the terrorist watch list in California, these gotaways undoubtedly include terrorists, convicted criminals, and the cartel's drug smugglers. In fact, something again new on this trip, this was my fourth trip to the border, something new. They were averaging 90 Chinese military-aged nationalists crossing in the Rio Grande Valley every day. 90 Chinese nationalists every day crossing our border. Probably the saddest thing I heard about from the Border Patrol is they shared the horrific situation and the repeated sexual assault young women are enduring to come here. They compared it to a never-ending cycle of sex slavery. That was their term, sex slavery by the cartels. In fact, the cartel had made $13 billion last year in the sex slavery industry. And they told us that these young ladies enter a lifetime of debt to their criminal traffickers. So many other people turned in to indentured servants. These smugglers are also bringing in lethal fentanyl that's poisoning our children. 300 young adults dying every day in America from fentanyl poisoning brought across our southern border. The data we received in the briefings given to us by the Border Patrol, by local law enforcement, and the CBP do not reflect a border that's closed, far, far from being closed. It's a border that's been erased by failed leadership in the White House. Under the current circumstances, only 10% of the Border Patrol agents are actually tasked with securing the border. Only 10% of them are doing the job they were hired to do. The other officers, they're tasked with running the refugee camp, acting as nurses and social workers. But it didn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. On every trip, I've asked the Border Patrol, what do you need? And in past trips, they talked about we need more doctors, we need more dentists, we need more help, more cooks. But this time they didn't ask for more officers or resources. What they specifically asked for was policy changes from this administration. They asked for policy changes from this administration. These are people on the ground. These are the people that have been doing it. Again, multi-generational officers whose fathers and grandparents had patrolled these same borders. They asked for policy changes. Secretary Mayorkas has stripped them, the Border Patrol, the tools they need to secure a border. What they asked was to reinstate the Remain in Mexico policy and end catch and release. It's that simple. This could be all accomplished with the President's pen. He created this crisis. He can end it. Thank you. I yield back.
Madam President,
Senator from Indiana.
much better than you all expected. That's what President Biden said when asked about the conditions at the border after the expiration of Title 42. Much better than you all expected. At the end of a week that saw a record 10,000 illegal crossings a day, he says, much better than you all expected. Those were just the ones that were stopped by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But the president's statement is clearly disconnected from the on-the-ground reality at our border. Everyone knows that. And as far as I can tell, the Biden administration's policy when it comes to the southern border is largely to do the opposite of what the previous administration did. This is the Costanza policy of border security. Whatever the previous president did, do the opposite. Within his first 100 days in office, President Biden stopped construction of the border wall, but he didn't stop there. He halted deportations, but he didn't stop there. He suspended the Remain in Mexico policy. As a result of these and other actions, there have been at least 6.4 million illegal border crossings at the southern border since the president assumed office. Now, to put that in perspective, and this is just the number of people who we've seen and been able to track come across the border illegally. So we know there are far more. But I represent a state, the great state of Indiana, where the population is 6.8 million. It's a whole lot of people. Since 2021, hundreds of thousands of children have been trafficked across the southern border. 85,000 unaccompanied children are now missing, Madam President. Last year, overworked and underappreciated Border Patrol agents apprehended more than 12,000 illegal immigrants who had already been convicted of a crime. Again, just the ones we've been able to apprehend. This year so far, those agents have stopped 82 people, according to my most recent count, from crossing the border, and they are on the terror watch list. Fentanyl, smuggled across the border from Mexico, is now the leading cause of death for Americans between ages 18 and 49. Record numbers of migrants are dying, swept away in the currents of the Rio Grande. So many, in fact, that law enforcement has to keep refrigerated trucks at the ready to store the drowned bodies. The administration pretends that its lax border policy is somehow humane. It's the benighted, ultra-MAGA conservatives, the mean Republicans in this vision that are inhumane. Well, I have to say, swamping our law enforcement officers, overwhelming our resources, allowing lethal drugs to spread through our communities, not discouraging migrants from a deadly journey to the border, this is inhumane. In saying so and demanding a measure of border security is not anti-immigrant. It's pro-American. These are not Republican talking points. These are the sentiments of regular Americans. The failure to plan for the end of Title 42, to enforce our immigration laws, to secure the southern border is a disaster. Americans, no matter their political party, know it. But the President of the United States does not seem to understand. In New York City, where illegal migrants have displaced homeless veterans in hotels, Mayor Eric Adams said, quote, "The President and the White House have failed this city." The truth is, when it comes to the border, the President and the White House have failed this country. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I'm pleased to join with my colleagues to talk about a topic that I've talked about many times before on the floor of the United States Senate. Obviously, coming from a border state, the humanitarian, the public safety crisis occurring at our border, which has raged for the last 2 years under this president, has finally made every state a border state, every city a border city, because the entire nation is feeling the impact of the open border policies of the Biden administration, because migrants are being shipped to places like Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C. And so the mayors are saying, whoa, we can't take this, even though border communities in Texas have encountered 5 million migrants during the Biden administration. I'm sympathetic, but there's no sympathy. And actually, we don't really want sympathy. We want action to deal with this influx of humanity that will soon become a tsunami. As I said, since the president took office, Customs and Border Protection have logged about 5 million border crossings. Because of COVID-19, there was a public health law in place, Title 42, which we've talked about many times, which was applied by the Border Patrol to expel 2.4 million of those 5 million migrants. But I know the numbers get a little tricky here. But at the same time, Border Patrol has said they encountered 5 million migrants during the Biden administration. They also say perhaps as many as 1.2 million migrants got away. In other words, they were seen on sensors or cameras, but the Border Patrol missed them. Or they simply evaded Border Patrol because either they were involved in some sort of criminal activity or they did not want to get detained because perhaps they didn't qualify for asylum. So up until last week, under Title 42, the Border Patrol was able to quickly expel legal migrants who had no legal basis to stay in the United States. Title 42 is gone, which means that nearly 50% of migrants that Border Patrol actually encountered and were able to expel under that rule, they no longer are able to do that. It's nearly impossible to get an explanation from the Biden administration about where the remaining 2.7 million migrants are. What we do know is the Biden administration is releasing an unprecedented number of these migrants into the interior of the United States. Some of them, if you've got good vision, you can see the green part of these bars. These are people who are claiming asylum. It's really a rather small part of this total number. So far in March, exceeding 100,000 migrants at the border. Just a relatively small number are claiming asylum. So what happened to the rest of them? Well, there's something called parole, P-A-R-O-L-E. Now, we may think of parole as something, if someone's been in prison, they get paroled, but this is different. This is something that the Customs and Border Protection does. They claim the authority to do this on a categorical basis, simply to relieve the load on law enforcement officials and customs officials at the border. Effectively, what this means is even if people aren't claiming asylum, which at least a small fraction we know would have an opportunity to present their case in front of an immigration judge, and a small fraction of the total number would perhaps be able to prove their right to asylum under the law, the Biden administration has said, we don't really care whether people are seeking asylum or not. We're going to release them into the interior of the United States using parole, and tell them to show up at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement office in a town near you and make arrangements for your case to be processed there at the local level. Now, there have been some recent developments. In Florida, a federal judge has now enjoined Customs and Border Protection's ability to use parole, or I should say abuse parole, by releasing mass numbers of migrants, perhaps never to be heard from again. The judges said essentially that parole should be used on a case-by-case basis, not to relieve the load at the border because so many people are showing up. You know, charitably, maybe that's what Secretary Mayorkas means when he says the border is secure. In some sort of twisted way, he thinks 5 million people coming to the border and another 2.7 million of those people being released into the interior of the United States somehow means the border is secure. Well, not under any rational definition of border security is the border secure. So what is the Biden administration supposed to do? Well, back when President Clinton was in office, he signed into law an authority called expedited removal. This would allow the Border Patrol to remove people on an expedited basis, but it takes a little time. And so historically what has happened is those people have been detained until their expedited removal is accomplished. But this administration has dismantled detention facilities necessary to keep people while their expedited removal process is going forward. Instead, they're released. You've heard people talk about catch and release. That's catch and release. That's the big hole in the bottom of the bucket through which this vast sea of humanity is flowing. The truth be told, there's a lot the administration doesn't know, or simply isn't telling the American people about where these migrants are today. Recently, the New York Times did an investigative piece about some of the unaccompanied children who've been released by the Biden administration into the interior of the country, and documented the fact that many of them are in positions where they're performing forced labor, violating child labor laws, unable to protect themselves, unable to provide for themselves. They are simply being forced to work in violation of child labor laws. And they have apparently no adult supervision, no responsible adult supervision to protect them. In a strange sense, that may be the least bad thing that could happen to some of these unaccompanied children. Others, I'm sure, have been recruited into gangs, have been neglected, abused, sexually assaulted, sold into sex slavery. It just boggles the mind. I keep asking myself, Mr. President, what's it going to take? What has to happen before the Biden administration wakes up to its failures on the border and the human consequences associated with it? I haven't even mentioned, the senator from Indiana did mention, the fact that across these same borders, while this flood of humanity is coming across, Border Patrol is distracted or preoccupied with administrative tasks, and so the drugs that have killed 108,000 Americans have come across those borders, including 71,000 last year from synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Well, now that Title 42 has expired, the number of people coming across is going to skyrocket. I've been sort of strangely amused at some of the press reports that, well, the numbers weren't as bad as we expected. I think maybe that's what President Biden said. Oh, it wasn't as bad as we expected. Well, these criminal organizations that transport migrants to the border and that also smuggle drugs into the United States, they're not stupid. And they realize that the eyes of the world, certainly of our country, was on the border to see, okay, now Title 42 has gone away, what's going to happen? Well, they just simply restricted the number of migrants that they transported to the border in order to make it look like there was not a surge. But we already know that 10,000 migrants a day being encountered. One Border Patrol agent said he thought that would go up to 11,000 to 14,000 a day. The Biden administration has gone to great lengths, not to secure the border, but to make it easier for migrants to be released into the interior of the United States. Earlier this year, for example, the administration announced a new plan to address a specific subset of the border crisis, the way migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were treated. What the administration said is, we're not going to secure the border, we're not going to prevent illegal immigration, we're actually going to confer legal status on 30,000 migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela a month. 30,000 a month. And then we're going to take that out of the top number, so it makes it look like we actually have less migrants coming into the country illegally. Well, 30,000 a month, 360,000 a year. Without Congress's consultation or consent, we are a co-equal branch of government. The president has no authority to do that on his own. Last week, the administration finalized a rule to funnel even more migrants into parole which, as I said, is being abused. It's supposed to be done on a case-by-case basis to release even more migrants into the interior of the country. It's interesting the way rules and laws are named some here in Washington, because frequently they're the opposite of what they claim to be. So here the administration has issued a new rule called the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways Rule, framed as a way to promote orderly migration and ensure those who don't play the rules are ineligible for asylum. In addition to the fundamentally false promise that these parole programs constitute lawful pathways, they don't. The rule is brimming with loopholes that were designed to give migrants a clear and easy path into the United States. It's a roadmap. All migrants have to do is claim that they're illiterate or say they experience technical issues with the CBP One app that the administration wants them to use to schedule their appearance at the border. Well, the administration says they could still be paroled into the United States and given a work permit. Talk about a pull factor. You know, we hear a lot about the push factors of illegal migration, and those are real. Violence, poverty, we all understand that, people wanting a better life. But we admit we naturalize or make American citizens out of 1 million migrants a year. But turning this process over to the criminal organizations and cartels that smuggle not only people, but drugs in the United States has proven to be an absolute humanitarian disaster. By outlining broad exceptions that are easily gamed, the Biden administration has provided migrants and the cartels that exploit them with a playbook. They can make the dangerous journey to the border, show up at a port of entry without an appointment, say the magic words, and be released into the United States, courtesy of the Biden administration. Or they can cross between the ports of entry and claim to face an imminent and extreme threat to their life or safety in northern Mexico and be waved into the United States as well. Day after day, the Biden administration is allowing more and more migrants to enter the United States, despite the fact that the vast majority of these individuals have no legal basis to be here. At the same time, the administration is doing less and less to enforce the law and to remove those who have no valid asylum claim in the United States. As you can see here, this is Immigration and Customs Enforcement is the federal agency responsible for removing people who have illegally come to the United States. And as you can see, in fiscal year 2019, it was over 250,000. Fiscal year 2020, it was just under 200,000. Fiscal year 2021, it was just over 50,000. Fiscal year 2022, about 75,000. So not only has President Biden opened the front door, he's closed the back door when it comes to removing people who have no legal right to be here in the United States. Well, this isn't an accident. This is deliberate. This is a plan, and it's an outrage. This is all part of a deliberate effort. I've tried to figure out, okay, maybe the Biden administration doesn't understand, or maybe we just have a different interpretation of the law. But I've come to conclude that that's not true. Can't possibly be true. So my only conclusion is this is part of a deliberate plan. You let more people in and you remove fewer people who cannot legally be present here in the United States. The Circumvention of Lawful Pathways rule is dangerous, and it's not a serious effort to secure the border. It's a fig leaf. And I will be introducing a Congressional Review Act resolution to strike it down. This rule is part of the Biden administration's shell game to conceal an unprecedented level of illegal immigration on their watch. Because of the loopholes, it will fail to deliver the serious consequences that the administration claims. And it will fail to deter people from making the long and dangerous journey to our border when they have no legal claim to enter our country. So I hope the Senate will soon vote to strike down this rule and send a clear message to President Biden that his job is to enforce the law as written. I agree with the senator from North Dakota, Senator Hoeven. He said the president has the tools. I mentioned expedited removal, which President Bill Clinton signed into law. The president just simply refuses to do the job he took an oath to do. To uphold and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States. He has no authority to rewrite the laws through executive actions or rulemaking. And I hope the Senate will say so when we vote on the congressional resolution of disapproval. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Brian Hutchinson, a fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the Congress.
Without exception.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 10 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without exception or objection.
Mr. President, thank you. I, too, rise to make known my concerns with the administration's decision to terminate the use of Title 42 authority to protect our borders. I particularly make this point at a time in which it's clear that what was to follow the use of Title 42 is not in place. I visited the southern border with the senator from Texas who was just speaking in January. I've had several additional visits to that border while Title 42 was in place. It was useful and valuable for me to see the nature of the problem and the challenges over the last several years. But it's also true I can see the consequences of what's taking place on our borders in my own home state of Kansas. I talked when I was at the federal border with federal law enforcement officials. They've risen to the challenge of apprehending and vetting, documenting hundreds of thousands of migrants. However, the situation at the southern border is made more difficult for the DEA to interdict the cartels and drug smugglers and for the FBI to vet national security threats. Repealing Title 42 without a robust plan of action has left our law enforcement agents with a disastrous situation on the border. Our Border Patrol agents and officers are being asked to be caretakers, law enforcement, medical professionals, and so much more. The fact of the matter is that our country does not have an operational control of the border and will continue to fail to do so if we continue down the current path. The U.S. Border Patrol apprehended more than 1 million migrants who crossed illegally between just October and March, and it detained more than 2.2 million migrants during all of fiscal year 2022. Agents have been averaging about 1,100 arrests a day this month at the El Paso sector, and on Wednesday of last week, more than 2,000 migrants were arrested in the one section alone. Fentanyl seizures. Often we think of border challenges as someone coming to take our jobs, and perhaps there's a component of that, but we ought to be focused on terrorism, national security, drugs, law enforcement, human trafficking. Fentanyl seizures at the southern border increased 48% in April of 22 compared to April of 21. The situation at our southern border is a danger to our national security. As border agents, they're pulled away to deal with the record number of migrants and are left without the manpower to try to stop drug trafficking and human trafficking. President Biden must act to ensure stricter enforcement of our immigration laws, reinstate the construction of a wall or fencing in areas that are largely unprotected, and the administration must send a message loud and clear that our border is closed to unlawful entrance. The U.S. is a nation of migrants, we're a nation of refugees, but we're also a nation of law and order. Migrants camping on the streets of El Paso in scorching heat, mothers wading across rushing rivers, clinging to their infants, girls caught by traffickers and cartels out in the desert. These are consequences of a disastrous border policy. The President and his Secretary handling this crisis at the southern border, the way it's being handled, is unacceptable. Congress must work together to deliver lasting solutions that secure our border, keep our communities safe, and ensure the humane treatment of people. Securing our southern border isn't a Republican or Democratic issue. It isn't a Texas or Arizona issue. It isn't just a U.S. or Mexico issue. Every state is a border state, including my own of Kansas. If we truly want to help migrants, then we need to create a fair and humane asylum process, and we need to stop the illegal crossing at the southern border that undermine our laws and jeopardize our national security. Americans, Kansans, are tired of paying the cost of inaction to make any serious policy changes at the southern border. Administration has made clear that it is unwilling to take the meaningful action necessary. While it's easy to criticize the administration, let me also say that it also means that it's up to this Congress, this legislative body, to work together to find solutions in this regard, solutions that ensure our national safety, establish humane asylum process, and end the crisis at the southern border. Madam President, I yield the floor.